From the CPRE Knowledge Hub and cprehub.org, this is Research Minutes, a deep dive into new and important research in the realm of education. I'm Michelle Goodwin. Today we're taking a guided expedition away from our Philadelphia studio and striking out into the heart of the desert. Well, a figurative desert.
Depending on how we define a desert, about 10% of the American population lives in one of these places. And so that might not sound like a big number, but we're talking about millions of people.
We've heard of food deserts, urban areas where fresh, affordable food can be nearly impossible to come by. Well, a new field of research is studying the same idea in the field of higher education. They're called higher ed deserts, where residents have limited or no access to public, broad access four-year colleges. And like their namesake, higher ed deserts can be a big problem for those stranded.
These same communities have the lowest educational attainment levels, and that's not a surprise because these communities just don't have a place nearby to, increase that human capital.
Today we welcome Nick Hillman, Associate Professor with the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis, and one of a small number of researchers currently studying the impacts of higher ed deserts in America. Professor Hillman sits down with Robert Nathenson, research specialist with the Consortium for Policy Research and Education at the University of Pennsylvania, to discuss his findings and offer some tips to those hoping to understand and address this unique challenge.
Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
Nick, you have published a number of articles and reports on education deserts, such as Geography of College Opportunity, the Case of Education Deserts, as well as an American Council on Education report, Education Deserts, the Continued Significance of Place in the 21st Century. I'd like to start off by asking, what is an education desert?
That's a good question to start with. There is not a definition that is permanent, and there's not a definition that is going to always satisfy everybody's imagination when it comes to the education desert. It's more of a concept, maybe even a proof of concept that place matters. And so in these papers that I've published, I have to define it somehow, and I use a pretty extreme definition in my mind. And it is a community that either has zero public colleges in it or only one public college in that community. And so there are two different, I think, sort of challenges right off the bat with this definition. The first one is, well, what the heck makes up a community in the first place? And then the second one is, why public colleges? And so if I may indulge for a minute here, the idea of community or the idea of local area could be defined in so many different ways, but at least the way I've been thinking about it, and this is also the way that Raj Chetty and his team have been working on upward mobility in geographic areas, they use these clusters of counties that are called commuting zones. And so we might be more familiar with metropolitan statistical areas or micropolitan statistical areas, but if we only restricted analysis to those types of areas, we'd limit ourselves from a lot of rural places that aren't captured in those. And so anyhow, these commuting zones include all the counties across the U.S., and they use what is called journey to work data. So it basically takes people's home addresses, their work addresses, and sees literally where people are commuting back and forth. And so counties statistically cluster into commuting zones. So there are like 750 or so commuting zones around the country. And so each one of those commuting zones is a local area. And so in a commuting zone, if there are zero public colleges, then they're an education desert. If there is only one public college that's an open access institution, then it's an education desert.
I think that's really relevant because a lot of the decision-making process for individuals are where are they going to attend school, and often that's a local decision. One question I had was, could you provide an example of an education desert?
Yeah, I'll start with one example. I want to jump back to the point that you just raised, though, because it really is a fundamental one. You said that educational choices, college choices, are very local decisions, and that's absolutely correct. Interestingly, though, when you start to dig into the academic research and even the policy research and kind of listen in on these policy conversations, that silence would be deafening. This would not be an issue that comes up. And I think only in the recent last couple of years, maybe even still today, there's still a lot of room to go. But I think it's almost like a new awareness that college choice is an extremely localized decision, but we don't always think about it that way. So I think that fits right into this, and that's why looking at place matters so much in college access and college understanding college inequality. But your question, though, is about an example. And so I'd love to share one example. And this hits a little bit too close to home, literally too close to home. But I noticed that these are stories that can be replicated all across the country. And so in my home town, northern Indiana, Elkhart, Indiana, my own personal family experience was caught up in this whole entire idea of education desert. My parents, my siblings who live up there were all unemployed during the recession, like 25% of Elkhart County. It was a very, very depressing time for that place. And by an economist's sort of thinking, and I'm no economist, but an economist might say, well, now you have all these unemployed labor, their opportunity cost to go back to college is extremely low. So they have now time to go and invest in themselves by going back to college. And that sounds great on paper. And in some places around the country, that's exactly what happened. But in Elkhart, Indiana, that did not happen. And the reason, I think, one of the main reasons why it did not happen is because there's not a college nearby. And so I think that was sort of the aha moment. Like these are these real important structural barriers that are sort of hiding in plain sight. So in Elkhart County, northern Indiana, there is a technical college, a community college that's sort of in a strip mall. But if you want to go to a 4-year sort of bachelor's degree institution, you're going to drive a half hour away to South Bend. And if you're anything like my family, transportation is not always reliable. And there are expenses that go along with making that commute daily. So that's one example of education desert. However, in my research, I highlight these places all over the country. You could go down to the border of Texas, and you could find one community, the Uvalde Eagle Pass commuting zone, and there's one community college, and there are about 100,000 people live there. You go 3 hours north, and you find a very similarly sized community that has about 4 public colleges and the same amount of people who live there. Why is it that just a few hours away, you have 4 colleges in a community that is actually largely white, and then you have 3 hours south, only one community college in a community that's largely Latino?
That was a great example of helping to illustrate, I think, which is something that is pervasive across the country, where you have some communities in which there are many institutions to choose from and some communities in which they're not. And these are not randomly distributed. Sometimes they break along race and ethnic lines, and sometimes they break, as you mentioned, on educational lines. And I want to get to that, back to that point in a moment, because you talk about that in detail on your paper. But some of what you said just a few moments ago, I think is really informative, because to me, your work on education deserts fits firmly within the geography of opportunity literature. And that's something that you mentioned has not been focused on a lot in academia and policy fields. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about the geography of opportunity framework and its implications for social mobility.
It's a great question, and I would answer this by qualifying that I am not a geographer. But you know, there are geographers, there are other people in social sciences across the board who are really looking at the role that what we call built environments play in shaping opportunities. So built environment, we can think about it in terms of where are our supermarkets located, and people have looked into this with respect to food deserts. Several years ago, that became a popular concept, and so popularized that it's actually now in the Farm Bill. So legislation has acted upon these structural inequalities that exist in terms of how to get nutritious and healthy, affordable food into communities that simply don't have it nearby. And to assume that somebody can, drive to some far off neighborhood to buy healthier choices or healthier food just doesn't quite fit with the way that we know that people behave within their communities. And so geography of opportunity really wrestles with the idea of your built environment, the infrastructure that are in place, whether it's food, public libraries, public transit, your availability of healthcare clinics. There are healthcare deserts as well. We look at our schools as one of these other very important social institutions located in communities where people live and work. And so to blend our infrastructure with our behaviors is I think really where the field is heading, and it's where geographers, especially critical geographers, have already gone, and it's where I think behavioral economists are really interested in as well. They want to see why is it that people might make sort of suboptimal decisions, at least theoretically suboptimal decisions. And sometimes it's because of proximity, convenience, stress, time, habits, you name it, all these sort of things that are part of not just our individual experiences, but also functions of our built environments.
I couldn't agree more. So specifically in the context of higher education, the concept of an education desert, the geography of opportunity present an alternative structural framework for thinking about college choice than the traditional individual choice model. So how do the frameworks differ, and what does a spatial orientation to higher education help shed light on that the individual choice approach might overlook?
The people doing a lot of the really pioneering college choice research, there's a book in the 80s about college choice, and there were several very lasting and important studies throughout the 90s that extended that work. And then I think probably in and out, it's been updated over the years, but this is sort of a long tradition in our profession, in our field of trying to understand how people make choices. And so I think that the geographic piece, the geographic element has always been there. It's not necessarily been the center of attention. So it's kind of acknowledged, given a hat tip, I suppose. And then we focus more on procedural opportunities. So we focus a lot of attention, research and policy wise, on how can we get better information in the hands of consumers? How can we help students be more prepared for college by, exposing them to schools or sort of teaching them about the expectations and the academic expectations of college, how to navigate financial aid, you name it. All these sort of procedural steps have lately become where a lot of the excitement is in terms of the academic research and policy research, because these are things that you can manipulate. These are things that you can run an intervention on and run interesting trials on and really find important and useful things that can inform practice. Geography is a tougher nut to crack. I think that it's always been there in college choice research and the way that people think about college choice. But it's one of those things where it's like, well, what do we do about it? How can we manipulate geography? How can we change that? And I think that there are answers. But I think that's also why we focus more on the process of college opportunity rather than the geography of college opportunity.
Yeah, they're both important fields of research, and I think you've done a particularly good job shedding some light on the geography of opportunity. And so this, I want to talk about some of the specific findings that you found in your work around college opportunity and variation across different education deserts. And so before we get into some of those details, I was just wondering if you could clarify some of the terms that you use. For instance, selectivity, sector, and proximity.
Yeah, great question. Great place to start. So selectivity assumes that colleges review applicants that come in. So a student must apply to the college. The college has to then screen out the students who could get admitted and not admitted. And depending on the college's selectivity, you can peg a number to it. So an institution might get 100 applicants, but only accept 50. So their selectivity level would be 50%, which would be pretty darn selective. Most colleges are pretty open access or broad access institutions where they admit upwards of 80, 90, or even 100% of applicants. So even if we oftentimes have an image in our head of a student, applying to a number of colleges and casting wide nets in terms of where they're applying, I think the modal number of applications is like 1 or 2. Most students apply to a pretty narrow set of schools. And so selectivity matters because I oftentimes, and I think we as a field don't oftentimes think about broad access institutions and open access institutions where they actually enroll the lion's share of students. So selectivity matters in this respect because I'm very less interested in highly selective schools. I'm more interested in schools that are open access and broad access because those are the ones that students can walk freely in and out of, at least in terms of the application process being a hurdle that shouldn't be as large as it is in other places. Another term, though, you mentioned was sector. Sector refers to sort of a combination of two things. On one hand, you've got public, nonprofit, and private. So that's sort of one way that we like to distinguish among institutions within the higher education marketplace, whether they're state operated, whether they're nonprofit or whether they're for-profit. So those are the three categories. But then within each of those three categories, you might have a community college that serves primarily students who are interested in 2-year-long programs, the associate's degrees. But then you also have within the public sector, your major research university like here at UW-Madison, University of Wisconsin-Madison. But you also have regional 4-year colleges as well. So within the 4-year sector, you've got 2-year and 4-year institutions. Same story goes in the nonprofit and the for-profit sector. So all that long-winded answer is to say that it's a way to distinguish different types of institutions within the marketplace of higher education. The last one is proximity.
Right.
And you could think of proximity in a number of ways. It could be the time that it takes to get from point A to point B. It could be the miles between point A and point B, or it could simply be, like I described earlier, sort of clusters of areas that share some common economic features. In my research, I use the latter. I don't measure distance in time or miles. However, there are other researchers who have been looking at geography, and they do just that.
Also, when we talk about sector, there are for-profit institutions and there are also online higher education institutions. But for the purposes of some of the research that you've been doing, you won't be talking about those today.
That's right. So that was really tricky with respect to geography and place, because what I do in my analyses, I exclude colleges that are primarily online. If more than half of the students are online, they're not in my analysis. And that's, I think, important in terms of geography, because that kind of goes into the solutions of what do you do about an education desert?
There are a couple different concepts that you mentioned in your paper when you're talking about some of your findings. And one is the concept of community ties. Another is about positive spillovers. And the third is around the demand elasticity for application to higher education institutions. And I was wondering if you could discuss each of those as we begin to talk about some of your findings.
These positive spillovers is really interesting, where there are some studies showing that simply having a college nearby induces people to enroll in college. So it's not just building a college, but also having people who migrate to college towns. But in either case, these colleges have positive spillovers where whether it's just that it's more visible, whether there's just a more of a sort of understanding of how the college going process works. It's kind of a mystery of why this happens, but the idea is that having a college nearby increases people's chances of going. In terms of distance elasticity, we can think about that in terms of the further away that you are from a college, the less likely you are to enroll. And so it might do me no good to know that a college that's a really good fit for me is several hundred miles away, because I'm not going to change my behaviors because of that. My choice set are going to be more localized. So there's sort of I don't know, sometimes people call it the friction of place, but there's sort of this tipping point where it's just too far away that imposes too high of costs for people. That's how we talk about demand elasticity in terms of distance. The third one was on cultural ties or community ties, and this is one that is harder to pinpoint with a number, but it is incredibly important, and I think the most important in terms of all three of these, and that is that people have familial commitments to their communities. They have social commitments to their communities. That's where they work. That's where they live. That's where their family and friends live. And so when thinking about college choice, it's not just that a student has information about a college, but it's also, where are their friends going? Where are their family going? Where are their other commitments in their lives keeping them? And so to understand choice, you have to understand all three.
So one point I wanted to follow up on was around this idea of distance elasticity. Because you mentioned that it follows a bit of a U shape in which the quantity or the desire to go and apply to enroll in a school decreases the farther it is from your home. But then eventually it increases again. And so what this to me implies is that there are really kind of two markets when it comes to higher education. They're the students who are the localized students who want to enroll for those different reasons, including the community ties. And then there's a separate segment of the population, a smaller segment of the population, where they are submitting more applications all across the country where the place doesn't matter. And those are typically, but not always, students who might be more mobile because their families have greater resources. And so I wanted to raise that. And before we go into some of your findings, just talk about that a little.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what is interesting and important about all of this is that you're right. There are two different markets. There are very different profiles of students. And the concern that I have is that policy conversations oftentimes focus on the latter group, the high flyer students, the very mobile students. And I think the reason policy conversations focus on these students is because the policymakers themselves or the staff members that are advising these policymakers or the advocacy community that sort of surrounds these policymakers maybe have had that as their experience. And so I think that this, for me, is a way to be more culturally competent, more open, and more representative of students who don't always get their voices heard in these conversations. And so the marketplace that's highly localized, northern Indiana, the border town I referred to earlier, these communities where people are making choices, they're choosing the college down the street. I think that we need to not only validate their experience, but also understand it in ways so that our policy prescriptions don't unduly harm those same individuals.
There were a number of really interesting findings from your work suggesting that education deserts are pervasive throughout the country, whether they're in metropolitan areas, suburban areas, micropolitan areas, rural areas. And also there's some variation across racial and ethnic lines, as well as the average education level in a community. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those points.
I'll start with the latter one, the educational attainment level. These education deserts, by the definition I outlined in the very beginning, these same communities have the lowest educational attainment levels. And that's not a surprise because these communities just don't have a place nearby to increase that human capital. So I think that one is both not surprising but fundamentally important. And so any state that's trying to improve their college attainment rates or college completion rates might want to take a close look at these communities to say, hey, wait a minute, we might actually be suboptimal here. There also are differences in terms of who lives in these places. There are a lot of rural places where we have a lot of white people live, but we also have growing demographics all around the country where we have a lot of Latino families moving into rural areas. And so we see both rural areas that are primarily white, but also communities that have large and growing Hispanic populations being tagged as education deserts. Within metropolitan areas or large cities, these are sometimes too big of a lens to really zero in on the choice process. So, for example, Lake County, where Chicago, Illinois is, Lake County is a massive county. I think maybe within that county, we could be looking at census tracts, or we could go a little bit more granularly in terms of maybe there are deserts within these metro areas. So I think that's where research could be going in the future. And I know that one particular study that Amalia Dace Garbino has written about Rochester, New York, which is, I think, one great example of how these urban areas, even within urban areas, have a lot of segregation and unequal opportunities within the confines of a city.
Yeah, to follow up on that point, you had mentioned in one of your pieces that the average educational attainment in education deserts was about 19%, but in places you classify as non-deserts, it's 23%. And so that's a 21% difference in the average education level across deserts and non-deserts. And so could you speak to the positive local and regional impact of having a more highly educated workforce might have, so those positive spillover effects?
Investment in higher education has consistently been found to be positive on average. So for each additional year of schooling, the individual returns is somewhere between 5 and 10%. I think people mostly peg it to about 7%. And that's not even including those social spillovers, which could include entrepreneurship, greater involvement in communities, more volunteerism, better health. You could go down the list of all these other positive benefits that come from investment in education. And so I think that part of the story here is that if you want good things, you've got to pay for it. And so I think that education is incredibly the case where this is true. And so when you have a community that maybe doesn't have the infrastructure to have a lot of college options nearby, or the college that's there doesn't have a wide sort of menu of options, it's possible that if you build it, they will come. It's possible that through that investment, not only will people maybe gravitate towards the community, but the people who already live there would benefit from having those opportunities available to them.
To get back to some of the variation across racial and ethnic lines in proportion of different groups of people living in education deserts. So I was wondering if you could spend a little bit more time talking about that.
Depending on how we define a desert, and again, using the definition of a place that has no or just one public broad access option nearby, about 10% of the American population lives in one of these places. And so that might not sound like a big number, but we're talking about millions of people. And so we've got, I think just by that cursory definition, already a sizable portion of folks who have structural inequalities at face value, just based on where they live. Now, if we wanted to play around with the definition, or if we wanted to get into details about, well, what are the different kinds of colleges that are even available in people's local markets, we might find that percentage rises even higher in terms of the kinds of, not just the number of opportunities, but like the kinds of opportunities that are available. And so I think that, again, coming back to the idea of a proof of concept, or at least shining a brighter light on the locality of college choice, I think is really the goal here. And whether or not we get the definition right is, I think, less urgent as is the sort of idea that place matters in all these ways we've been discussing.
What future research in this area do you have planned? Or how could further research benefit our evolving understanding of the structural inequalities of higher education access, equity, and opportunity?
One way is to flesh out this definition of an education desert. I think that the idea has some staying power. People are interested in it. It's helped us sort of shine a light on the locality of college choice in ways that we just haven't been doing enough of, and so that's exciting. But it's not the only way. It's not the only way we should be thinking about geography. And so a colleague at Baruch College, new professor there, Casey Boland, he and I have been working on a typology of local markets. And so we try to squeeze this idea of an education desert as far as we can. And so we have identified communities that not only have 0 colleges nearby, but maybe there are only 1 or 2 options. And so that wouldn't fit with the education deserts definition. And so these communities, they have maybe a couple of broad access colleges nearby. These communities would be a refuge. And so we also might have some communities around the country that have a whole lot of colleges nearby that are also broad access public institutions, and not just 2 or 3 of them, but several. And these communities could be called oasis if we want to try to expand our, squeeze this education deserts concept as far as we can. And we even have places around the country that are mirages, that have a lot of institutions nearby, but they're sort of off limits in terms of being too selective or too expensive for students. And so sort of thinking about deserts in sort of twisting the definition around in some ways that are more inclusive and maybe less deficit oriented, because just because there's a desert doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad place to live. The college that's located there might be doing wonderful things for their communities, and we want to be sure to lift that up and understand these deserts more, but also understand these other places, mirages, oases, and refuges.
So I had 2 final questions for you. One is, how does your work relate to states' historical planning of their higher education systems, and how does it inform states' future higher education decisions?
Well, it relates to historical context in fundamental ways. If you look down at the Black Belt of Alabama, the counties that have the plantations that have some of the most extreme stories of slavery, and you look at the structure of their colleges today, the colleges that are nearby, it maps almost perfectly with the Black Belt in Alabama. So we've got historical legacies that aren't just about sort of higher education planning, but also state-sanctioned racism and inequality. We still see the legacy of that today in many of our communities. It just gets reinforced through our higher education policies. There are some states that have made intentional efforts to have new colleges be built nearby so that people live within a certain commuting distance from their institutions. And so Ohio seems to be one that has a lot of colleges nearby. Their campuses are spread out across the state. And other places, they haven't quite taken the same kind of planning. So you see variations across states that are both functions of their education systems, but also functions of their broader political histories and legacies. What that means for today is that policymakers, especially at the state level, have no excuses for that history. They have all that information. They know this history exists. They know these inequalities exist, and so they're elected to solve problems. And so, from my vantage point, a state policymaker interested in this stuff would find out where they have structural inequalities in their state. If they're interested in geography, this is one way that they could go about pinpointing those inequalities, and then they could find ways to solve those problems that are related to those inequalities. So, for example, they might build the capacity of the institutions that are serving their communities. They might find ways to make those colleges more affordable, even more accessible. You might find ways to have better linkages between those colleges and maybe other institutions in their commuting zones or their high schools in their community. You name it. The context will differ from state to state, but I think that the relevance today is extremely important, and I think even more so politically for rural areas that are losing population, and these elected officials representing rural areas might be very interested in finding ways to reinvest.
I think that sometimes we focus on federal policy, but there's so much action and so much good work that's being done at the state level that it's really interesting to think about how the geography of institutions vary on a state-by-state basis. And the solutions would, of course, vary across the states. What are some ways in which institutions might be able to expand opportunities in education deserts?
Think of this in two ways. I think of this as sort of a neutral force and a proactive force. So I think on the neutral side, and this is where I started thinking about the education deserts topic in general, is related to some federal policy conversations that were aimed at trying to hold colleges more accountable for their outcomes. And at least at the time, a few years ago, policymakers were thinking about penalizing colleges that had the poorest outcomes. And on the face value, that makes a lot of sense. But then I started thinking, well, gosh, what if it's the only college in town? What if it's the only college nearby? Now they're not only going to be penalized, but maybe even could shut down. And is that going to leave people better off? And so sort of the neutral perspective is that maybe colleges that are located in these education deserts could get some sort of a waiver or some sort of exclusion or some sort of an appeal process to make sure that that communities weren't left sort of holding the bag there. On the proactive side, though, I think it really comes down to this idea of capacity building, and that term can sometimes be overused and nebulous in higher education, especially recently. But if we think about the resources that it takes to not only educate a student, but to educate a student in ways that sort of make up for some of the inequalities that they come to the door having with them. So, for example, students who are coming from highly segregated or unequal schools, students who are living in poverty or from low-income families, how can we not only provide them ample resources to educate them well, but also lift them up in ways that we're doing above and beyond at other places. And so this idea of capacity building might come in the form of greater financial assistance for individuals. It might come in the form of technical assistance for the colleges in these places. It might even come in the form of professional development and trying to help those colleges just make the most of their human resources that they have so that they are firing on all cylinders.
Nick, this has been really informative. I really appreciate your time, and thank you very much.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks for listening to Research Minutes, presented by CPRE Knowledge Hub. For more episodes or to subscribe to the series, visit us at cprehub.org. That's cprehub.org. To share your thoughts on today's episode or suggest future topics, follow us on Twitter at CPRE Hub. We look forward to you joining the conversation.